Hey everyone, it's audio producer Graham covering for Molly this week with the patron thanks. Now, I sorted it somewhere. Hang on. Here it is. Special thank you to Marina for upgrading her pledge this week. Thank you so much, Marina. And now, enjoy this week's episode covering the lost chapter and or alternate ending to Persuasion.
We are recording.
Yes, we are, and this is Becca.
This is Molly.
We're here to talk about Jane Austen.
We are here specifically to talk about
Persuasion. Listeners, if you're new here, I, Becca, have read many Jane Austen novels throughout my life.
And I, Molly, am reading her for the first time through this podcast.
If you want to hear Molly read through Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, or Emma for the first time, you can listen to seasons 1, 2, and 3 of this podcast respectively, but that is not what we're doing here today.
No, today we are talking about the, quote, canceled chapters of Persuasion.
Yes, that's right, listeners. So we literally just finished Persuasion. We had a great time reading it. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely.
So fun. So great. And it's been a really interesting one because it's a little bit more of a sweeping romance and less of a quirky class comedy than some of her other books. Not to say that her other books are not romantic or that this one isn't funny, just has a different sort of energy to it. And I don't know about you, but I think that comes from the fact that Jane Austen wrote this a little later in her life.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess, was this the last one she wrote?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like an end of life.
I don't think it feels like an end of life book.
It feels like a more introspective book than the other ones do.
And I think it just feels like Anne feels older than her other heroines. And I don't mean that to say Anne is old. She is 27 to 28 in this book, but she is more mature, more self-assured. She understands life a little better than, say, Emma Woodhouse or Marianne Dashwood, like these young, sort of brash, bubbly girls.
Yeah, she's not a Louisa Musgrove.
No.
She's an Anne Elliot.
She has, you get the sense Anne has always been a serious and sort of introspective person, but the way she is written, you can feel Austen's maturity as both a writer and also as a woman coming through the book.
Right.
All that being said, this was published posthumously.
Mm-hmm.
And Anne almost had a different ending to her story because Janie wrote a different ending, second-guessed herself, and said, "Now I can do better."
Yeah. And it's so interesting. And I was so excited to hear about this because, well, first of all, I didn't know what to expect from alternate ending because that's what everyone refers to it as. And to get a different version of the proposal or of the reuniting of Anne and Wentworth was so fun.
It was really fun and also really crazy because when it comes to Persuasion, the letter is iconic. It is the scene in that book. The way Proposal Get In is the scene in Pride and Prejudice. And it is just known that is the book.
Right.
That is the cornerstone of why the story works.
And to think that we almost didn't have it.
I know. And it almost ended, I don't want to say very differently because spoiler alert, they still got together.
Yeah, I mean, the last chapter is still the same.
Exactly. But the way it happens, I mean, it tells a different story.
It's a completely different story. And the thing is, the circumstances surrounding it are different. And Wentworth's admitting that he still loves her is different. But I think the through line is still the same.
I don't even know if I agree totally.
Well, should we dive into it?
Yes. Why don't we give our listeners a brief summary of the chapter up front?
Yes. So this is chapter 10, which replaces chapter 10 and chapter 11 in the draft that we ended up with. Also, before we dive into it, I want to say that as someone who considers herself a writer, of course we almost didn't get the proposal because it's not like she published her first draft. And it's very interesting that this chapter was kept in long enough that someone noticed there was a completely different ending in an earlier draft and decided to publish it.
This is the harms of posthumous publication is that, you get less control over what makes it out into the public.
Yes, I will say that on the website that we read these on, mullins.net, It says that the manuscript pages were passed on to Anna Austen Lefroy, who was Jane's niece, and were eventually published in part by James Edward Austen Lee, her nephew, as part of the second edition of his memoir in 1871. The full text of the canceled chapters was published by R.W. Chapman in 1926. The manuscript, the only original manuscript from the 6 major novels still extant, is now in the possession of the British Museum. So, just as some context.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So, this begins immediately after Anne finds out everything about Mr. Elliot with Mrs. Smith.
Yes. We get her walking back and processing the big bombshell she got from her friend.
She's thinking, how am I supposed to act around him now? How do I get rid of him? What am I going to do if he comes to the party? Because the party still has to happen.
Yes. And it's a very important party. Lots of plot at the party.
Yes, always. She's just like struggling, and she comes upon Admiral Croft,
who does not feature in the final chapters of this book.
No. And he is like, oh, are you going to see my wife, Mrs. Croft? She'll be so happy to see you. And Anne's like, no, I wasn't actually planning on going there, but I can if you want. And he's like, oh, she'll be so happy. Come on in. And she's like, okay, but if she, I like it, she's busy right now. Like she's with someone else. Like she's really trying to just like
get out of it.
Get out of that.
Yeah.
Go home process.
Yeah, we'll talk about this, but like really weird choice for Admiral Croft to be like, no, you have to come, because he's usually kind of perceptive in this book.
Yes. I think the thing is, I think he has ulterior motives here, and really wants her to come to their house.
Yes.
He brings her in, and she's like, okay, nobody's home though. She's panicking, thinking Wentworth might be there. So she's like, it's just Mrs. Croft there. And he's like, it's just Mrs. Croft. It's just Mrs. Croft. Brings her inside and says, oh, and Frederick, closes the door.
Whoopsies.
I lost my shit. I was like, wait, so many things going on in my head at this point. I'm like, does he think that Anne and Captain Wentworth, like, is he trying to push them together?
I mean, that's a really good question. You could read it that way, or you could read it less generously to Admiral Croft, given the later portion of this chapter.
Yes. I mean, okay, well, we can just get straight into it.
Yes.
Basically, so he leaves them together. He's like, I have to go, but you guys stay here. She'll be right down.
Yeah.
And then he's like, Wentworth, can I talk to you for a second? They have this like conversation. They close the door. It's supposed to be hushed, but he's just talking at full volume, thinking the door is blocking her.
Sure.
And he's
classic like older dude.
Yeah, he's like, oh, we'll just be out here. We're just gonna have a word. What's going on?
Yeah.
And he basically like she overhears him saying like, you have to talk to her. You have to talk to her. You promised, or like, promise me you'll talk to her. And he's like, fine. And so I'm like, what is he gonna talk to her about?
Oh, I don't know. What is he going to talk to her about?
What he ends up talking to her about actually makes complete sense to me.
Yeah, real estate.
I was like, yeah, this story, this would be the issue. So we find out that the Crofts heard that Mr. Elliot and Anne are a done deal. And their first thought is, fuck, they're going to want the house back. Where are we going to live? Find out if they want the house back. And so he's like, this is too awkward for me to talk about Wentworth. You do it for me. And Anne's like, but we're not a thing.
And she's like, much love and happiness, peace and blessings to Admiral Croft, but no thank you. Not even and she's like, none of that is true. And Wentworth's like, not even a little bit of it? And she's like, no, not even a little bit of it.
Not even a tiny, wait,
not even a teensy bit.
We have to read this. Yeah. By the way, listeners, if you do choose to read this alternate ending, it is written with all of her original typos and like annotations and like little like,
it's a very gentle way of saying it's borderline illegible.
Yeah, it's hard to read. So he says in a voice of effort and constraint, you must have heard too much already, madam, to be in any doubt of my having promised Admiral Croft to speak to you on some particular subject. And this conviction determines me to do it, however repugnant to my sense of propriety to be taking so great a liberty. You will acquit me of impertinence, I trust, by considering me as speaking only for another and speaking by necessity. And the Admiral is a man who can never be thought impertinent by one who knows him so as you do. His intentions are always the kindest and the best, and you will perceive that he is actuated by none other in the application which I am now with very peculiar feelings obliged to make. And then he stops, and then he takes some breaths, and he goes, the Admiral, madam, was this morning confidently informed that you were, I'm reading the whole thing, that you were, upon my word, I am quite at a loss, ashamed, the awkwardness of giving information of this sort to one of the parties. You can be at no loss to understand me. It was very confidently said that Mr. Elliot, that everything was settled in the family for a union between Mr. Elliot and yourself. It was added that you were to live at Kellynch, that Kellynch was to be given up. This the Admiral knew could not be correct. But it occurred to him that it might be the wish of the parties, and my commission from him, madam, is to say that if the family wishes such, his lease of Kellynch shall be cancelled, and he and my sister will provide themselves with another home without imagining themselves to be doing anything, which under similar circumstances, which would not be done for them.
Yeah,
This
I
is
love
all-
that. I love that it's written with this level of panic, though.
Yeah, there's a
It's-
lot of panic.
It's great because it's like he's pulling a bit of an Anne Elliot where he's like trying to say like the proper thing, but he's also like deeply in
He's
in
like,
his
I can't believe
feelings.
he literally says that I should be the person commissioned on this subject is extraordinary, and it is no less painful. Cuts himself off. A very few words will put an end to the awkwardness and distress we may both be feeling. So he's like, just put me out of my misery, please. And Anne just goes, uh.
And the thing about this is that Jane Austen is in these chapters like deeply overwhelming Anne because recall she just got this massive bomb dropped on her
Yes.
about Mr. Elliot, and now she hears that this is what's being said about it around town.
Yeah. And he says, like, just say that I need to drop a line to Sir Walter saying that they'll give up the lease of the house. Say that and it'll be done. And she says, no, sir, there is no message. You are the Admiral is misinformed. She says, there's no truth in any such report. And he goes, no truth?
No truth?
No truth. No truth in any part of it? None. And then he like comes and sits and takes her hands. And he's like, Anne, my own dear Anne. And then they talk about their feelings.
And a lot of that is very similar to
Very
the
similar.
original book.
But not, it's different in that in the original book, she gets time to process the proposal before they are together and talking about.
Yeah. And then the rest of the book kind of goes as the rest of the book goes in
Exactly.
the general. Yeah, the whole thing is much longer
Mm-hmm.
in the actual book. And I personally can see exactly why Jane Austen scrapped these chapters.
Why? I mean, yes, because what we got was better. But this is interesting. I feel like she gave Anne more agency here because honestly, Anne in this situation is the one saying, no, I'm not with him.
See, I disagree. I mean, I'm not saying Anne doesn't have agency here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that it's much subtler in the book because he still needs to be assured she's not with Mr. Elliot, but she has the tension of having to do it in front of other people is so palpable in the book.
True.
Because here they get to speak frankly to each other alone in
That's
a
true.
room, which like they haven't done all book. And the first thing he says is about his sister's lease. Whereas like one of the magic things in Persuasion is like the ways in which these two kind of like bounce off each other slightly in the book while other people are around them and they can't discuss what used to be between the two of them. And that is, I think that's just masterfully done in chapter 10 of the book. I also think like, so Better Call Saul. I keep going in the television references here, but hear me out. Better Call Saul is a prequel made to Breaking Bad, which is a famously great TV series. Better Call Saul built itself on the back end of Breaking Bad, knowing where it had to end up, but having to like not knowing how many seasons it had, having to sort of finagle its way there and sort of like make the ending feel inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jane Austen here gives us a great and sensible end to this book where, you know, Mr. Elliot's out of the picture. We tie back to the fact that the Crofts are at Kellynch and we get a confession of love from our hero and they end up happily ever after. What we get instead in the letter scene, and the reason that scene hits so hard, is this like long meditation on love from Anne that forces Wentworth to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And it's connected to the other love stories we've seen. It's connected to Henrietta and Charles Hayter. It's connected to Louisa and Benwick. It is connected to Louisa and Fanny. Like these stories that we've heard about all book that Anne has been privy to being discussed in the same room as Wentworth and bringing up everything between the two of them to the point where he can't take it anymore. And he is forced to find a way to talk to her about it without, you know, doing so in front of everybody. And he, in fact, does do so in front of everybody, but in writing. So they continue this subtle, propulsive need for each other in silence,
Mhm.
but in like end up in like the most romantic proposal of all time. And like again, it's all happening in front of everyone, which is so defining for these two characters through the book. So the way it all ties up to me so elegantly at the end in terms of themes, if not maybe as cleanly in terms of plot here as here. For me, it just like ties the whole thing together in a way that makes the story as a whole much stronger. Sometimes an ending makes a story stronger in retrospect.
Yes, absolutely, and to be clear, I do think the ending we ended up with I almost made Becca spit her water out.
Yes, we, Jane Austen,
We actually
wrote this book.
guys, surprise. Um, no, I think the ending that we ended up with is better, and I agree with you on everything. Actually, you kind of started to answer our patron study questions about this, which were from
Oh,
Avi. Why do you think Jane Austen discarded that ending? And did her family do a service or disservice by bringing them to light? I want to add to what you said because I do agree with everything that you said, actually. But I loved this because it felt okay. I read a lot of romance novels.
yes.
I read a lot of, like, smutty, like, tropey romance novels.
We love.
This, to me, felt like one of those scenes where, like, you're like, "Okay, I see that this is coming. They're gonna be alone in a room together." It's maybe a little bit lazily done. Like, the only reason that he was called in here or that she was called in here was so that they would end up in a room together, and when you're reading something like that, you're like, "Oh, yes, 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 it's happening, it's happening, it's happening, it's happening." And so, like, it's extremely immediately gratifying for the reader. And
Oh,
I think
yeah.
for Jane, I can picture her getting on this track and being like, "Yeah, they're gonna find out that she and Elliot are a thing, and they're gonna be concerned about their house. So they're gonna have Wentworth talk to her about it, and we're gonna put them in a room together. And when they're in the room together, everything's gonna come out." And it's a little sloppy. It's a little bit like cobbled together. It's a little bit too fast. Not everything that needs to get said gets said. And it's so exciting to get there. That being said, it is a first draft, or presumably it's an earlier draft. And so she was like, "Wait a minute, I can do it better. I can make it more relevant. I can make a story that is more relevant to the themes of the story as a whole." And
Yep.
so that's where we get those overheard conversations
Mhm.
that you're talking about. That's where it ties it more up in a literary context versus just a romance context.
Agreed. And I think the other, like, more, like, bare bones reason that she might have scrapped this one is that it's a little rushed.
Yeah, it's super rushed.
Yeah, and I think that, like, giving that extra chapter in the middle not only builds the tension out a little more, but justifies why Wentworth gets to the point that he needs to confess love to Anne.
Yes, exactly.
Because the last time we saw Wentworth at this point in time, he was storming out of the concert.
Yeah, he doesn't really get the growth here.
Yeah, we need him, like, understanding that there's hope.
Yeah. But to Avi's second question, did her family do a service or disservice by bringing them to light? I actually think it's a service.
This was fabulous.
Well, one, it's fabulous, and two, it shows how good a writer she is because we get to see an earlier draft, and that's how you know. It's like seeing if they're a good actor by seeing them behave when they're not acting and seeing them behave as a character. You have to see the transformation. So seeing how good she is at revising her own work. The first one, the canceled chapter, almost feels like a storyboard where she's like, "This is what needs to get said. And now we're gonna figure out how we can make it better in the context of the book." So, I think it's a service, and I think it's fun to have more Jane Austen to read.
Absolutely.
We also got a question from Katrine, which you also started to answer. How did the 2 endings differ emotionally, and what do they tell us about the love between Anne and Wentworth?
Oh, yeah, I mean, everything I said about the silence between the 2 of them,
Mhm.
the need and the longing that can't be repressed no matter how hard either one of them tries.
Mhm.
Um, it is so formed in this book by the fact that they are interacting again for the first time in 8 years in front of people who do not know what happened between the 2 of them 8 years ago. It's, like, vital to the fabric of this book that the 2 of them cannot speak candidly with each other about what's transpired, that they have to realize they can't live without one another in proximity to each other silently. That is what the book is at its core. And that's kind of why it's fitting that Wentworth writes it down at
Yeah,
the end.
exactly. Because in this ending, like we've said, it feels rushed and it doesn't feel as much like them,
Mhm.
but also all he says is my dearest whatever, and like he just takes her hands and he's like, "Oh my god, you are dear to me." But they don't get the same like the tension and build up that they've been getting the entire rest of the book. There's no explosion here.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have the same like this whole book has been very like sweeping emotionally. Like we've called it a sweeping romance a lot.
Yeah.
And this doesn't have that same like sweep you off your feet feeling.
No.
So all that to say, like we're very happy with the ending that we ended up with.
Yeah. And I also I'll say like one last little gripe with these last chapters. And I agree with you that like it is magical to watch someone at work who is as brilliant as Jane Austen. Like we got into this with our discussion of why she wrote. A little just to return to our prior question.
Mhm.
It is like sometimes women's craft is not taken as seriously in this time. Like Jane Austen was just writing as a little hobby, but you can see her artistry on display when you can see her understand when something's not working and wanting her plot to be as amazing as it can possibly be.
Yeah.
So good that she created tropes.
Yeah.
And to see like this was a good ending to a good story. She wrote a classic novel by reviewing and saying this isn't the ending that this needs. This needs something different, and then writing an ending that perfect to the story shows you how deeply she was thinking about how this story would come together.
Yeah. And without her thinking about that, we wouldn't get "You pierce my soul, I am half agony, half hope."
Yeah, and
One of the best lines about romance ever written.
oof, and the dedication it takes to write that letter correctly and to get it right is all magical. Oh, what I was gonna say as well is like it just like I don't like that like the conversation starts out with him being like, I need to figure out whether or not I need to write a letter to your dad about my brother-in-law's lease. Like that's kind of like a like unsexy way to start the like proposal.
Well, yes, it is not super sexy, but there's something for me about all of the misunderstanding leading up to it, at least from my perspective,
Mhm.
because she gets shoved into a room and he says, "Can you have a tete-a-tete with Captain Wentworth for a minute because I need to get out of here." And Anne is like, "Can I have a tete-a-tete with Captain Wentworth?"
Really quick, another note that I'm just going to gripe with lightly. Minor character assassination on Admiral Croft. I feel like he's a man of action and a man of words. He's like pretty outspoken during this book. He doesn't really like hide much.
Mhm.
So like I don't know if it tracks with this character to be like, no, you do it. And like, why ask Wentworth to do it?
Let's pick that apart a little bit because he says what she overhears is so the door's shut. He has no management of his voice, so she could hear him. She could hear his companion trying to check him. She could not doubt their being speaking of her. She heard her own name and Kellynch repeatedly. She was very much distressed. She knew not what to do or what to expect, and among other agonies, felt the possibility of Captain Wentworth's not returning into the room at all, which, after her consenting to stay, would have been too bad for language. They seemed to be talking of the Admiral's lease of Kellynch. She heard him saying something of the lease being signed or not signed. That was not likely to be a very agitating subject, but then followed, I hate to be at an uncertainty. I must know at once. Sophie thinks the same. Then in a lower tone, Captain Wentworth seemed remonstrating, wanting to be excused, wanting to put something off. Foo, foo, answered the Admiral. Now is the time. If you will not speak, I will stop and speak myself. Very well, sir, followed with some impatience from his companion, opening the door as he spoke. You will then, you promise you will? Why? Yeah, why? Why
Yeah,
does he not?
it's just weird. It's just like a weird circumstance. Like the Crofts are perfectly capable of discussing with Anne her like circumstances with Mr. Elliot. It's not any more proper for Wentworth to do it than it would be for Admiral Croft to do it, is it?
No, let me offer an alternative.
What if Admiral Croft is trying to get the two together? I know what you're saying, and that is a much better reading of this. I don't read it like explicitly in the text, but it could be implicitly there that the Crofts are shipping and they're pushing them together, and I will take it. But
I think they're shipping. I think they're shipping because there was no reason for him to bring her to their house at that very moment. Other
yes.
than to get her in a room with him. And specifically, they're not just talking about the lease. They want him to ask her if she's with Elliot
Yep.
And the lease is just the vessel
Mm-hmm.
for him to ask her that.
Yes.
So I think they're shipping. I don't know if there's enough supporting text leading up to it for them to ship, because they've both been very like under the radar with their feelings, but I wonder if in an earlier draft there was, or if Wentworth has talked to his sister.
Yeah, it's not in the text, but I mean, there's a version of Persuasion that could have been written where the Crofts are much more involved in trying to get these two together. They kind of play circumstantial and as a clear just demonstration of how great Captain Wentworth's family is. But there is a version where they are pushing these two together. That's not really the version we get of the story.
No, but I kind of love that idea.
I mean, I think one can read, much like Georgiana watching Darcy eat his Regency era Ben and Jerry's, you can read into it Sophie and Admiral. It's his first name, right? Admiral?
Yeah, Admiral.
Sophie and Admiral.
They call him Adam for short.
Sophie and Adam seeing Wentworth listening to his little like Beyonce breakup tunes and like crying over a picture of Anne Elliot, and then being like, dude, just ask her out. She's still single, man. Come on.
And he's like, no, she's not single. She's got a guy. And they're like, if
Yeah.
she had a guy, that would be bad for us.
Also,
so why don't we have him ask her about this guy?
Yeah. Also, Wentworth being like, but she broke my heart. You can hear her, Mrs. Croft be just like, oh, get over it.
Yeah, exactly.
Who do you think you are? She's great.
I love her.
Get over it.
Yeah. All right. This is what I'm now reading into this alternate ending. And listeners, you can tell us what you think, and if you think that that is in fact why he called her there, because I will read again this whole intro, which again I'll say is like very rushed and a little bit sloppy, but like, you were going to call upon my wife, said he. She will be very glad to see you. Anne denies it. She had not the time. She was on her way home. And he says, no, no, no. And he knocks on the door. He says, yes, yes, go in. She's all alone. Go in and rest yourself. For no reason. And Anne's like, I can't. What? Fine. She says, fine. I'll just ask Mrs. Croft how she is, but I can only stay 5 minutes. You're sure she's quite alone? Because, of course, she thinks Wentworth might be there. And he says, oh, yes, quite alone. No one but her mantua maker there. That must be a kind of tailor, because a mantua is a kind of women's garment. They've been shut up together this half hour. It must be over soon. And Anne's like, wait, it's so inconvenient for me to come while she's with her mantua maker. Let me leave my card, explain that I'll see her later. And he's like, no, not at all. Not at all. She'll be very happy to see you. I will not swear that she has not something particular to say to you, but that will come out in the right place. I give no hints. What hints? Oh, why, Miss Elliot, we begin to hear strange things of you, but you have not much the look of it, as grave as little judge. As grave as a little judge. What does that even mean?
Grave as a little judge?
Yeah.
Well, they're hearing saucy things about her, and she seems so serious and forlorn.
Oh, I see. As grave as a little judge. So he says, I thought we were not mistaken. So he thinks that he's figured it out. Sorry, listeners, that you're listening to me just read this in real time and try to parse it out. But like, he starts to bring it up with her, and then puts her inside with Wentworth.
And then he's like, Wentworth, you talk to her.
Yeah, but it's interesting because he's like, we heard some things about you, but you're not showing signs of it. I think we must have been correct in doubting that those were true. Why don't you go sit with my brother-in-law and talk to him?
You don't look that happy, so you're clearly not freshly engaged.
Right. So why don't you go sit with my brother-in-law? It's possible.
No, I mean, it's probable that's what Jane Austen meant. It's just not, I just hasn't been seeded through the book in the same way that somebody
Right.
thought.
Which is why I wonder if it might have been in an earlier draft more so.
It's possible.
But then why wouldn't they release that draft?
Well, maybe they don't have it.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's true.
I mean, that's kind of what's fun.
Yeah, it's all very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty to talk about here. I mostly just think it's a fun exercise to see Jane Austen's unfinished work.
Absolutely. No, it's super fun.
It's kind of like Love's Labour's 1 for Shakespeare.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is really fun. And I think that it'll be fun to hear our listeners' thoughts on it too, now that we've read it.
Yeah. And listeners, if you have a more legible copy of this extra ending, then please send it our way, because I had to decipher it today.
Yeah, no, I feel as though I read it at first kind of skimming over the bits that like, for example, so that you're aware of what we're looking at, it's like instead of the word would, it's a W and then in superscript, a D. So you just have to kind of be like, would be most inconvenient. And you're like, oh, yeah, would is would.
Yeah. I mean,
But
they used to have all sorts of ways to like shorthand stuff
Yeah.
because they used to actually have to write things out by hand, and we don't do that anymore. But because of that, like some of it's illegible because it's a lost art.
Yeah, I think that there probably is a better version of it. This one in particular says, quote, "The chapters are offered as written by Jane Austen in first draft form, complete with abbreviations and little attention to proper grammar or spelling." So that's why the version that we have is that. But
No shade,
perhaps
no
someone
shade
has-
to Jane.
No,
'Cause
never.
We've all been there.
Never shade to Jane.
Yeah, I think this has been fun though. Funniest quote.
Funniest quote. Gosh, I think
For me, it's the not even a little bit.
not even a little bit.
Not even a little bit.
Yeah, that is funny. No truth in any part of it.
No truth in any part of it.
I think I like. Oh, I just like. I cannot stay because I must go to the post office, but if you will only sit down for 5 minutes, I'm sure Sophie will come, and you will find nobody to disturb you. There is nobody but Frederick here, opening the door as he spoke. Such a person to be passed over as a nobody to her.
Nobody except the love of your life.
Yep. And there he is.
Yep.
No time to think
I feel like
about
it's a jump scare. Like,
Absolutely. She says, after being allowed to feel quite secure, indifferent, at her ease, to have it burst on her that she was to be the next moment in the same room with him. Iconic.
yeah. Questions moving forward?
I got none.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty complete. This
Yeah.
is its own sort of thing. Who wins this chapter?
I mean, listen, I'm going to give it to Admiral Croft for being the ultimate wingman.
Yeah,
I've decided.
It's canon now, and I'm sure like all of our listeners are gonna be like, yeah, that's exactly what you meant, guys.
Yeah.
But in our heads at least, he is trying to get the two of them together, and that's
how
why.
fun for us to come to that conclusion in real time.
Exactly. Like you guys are getting to see not only how Jane Austen's sausage gets made, but also how the Pod and Prejudice sausage gets made.
Yeah, full disclosure, listeners, normally I type up notes for us to go based off of, but for this one, we both just read the chapter and said, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, sheer vibes happening over at Pod and Prejudice, but also like, you know, this one required a little bit more off the cuff. I think it's because it is Jane Austen draft form, so we should be draft form.
Yeah, and also we decided in advance it was going to be a mini episode, so we figured we'd give you our raw and authentic selves. So we hope you enjoyed.
Because we're so practiced and polished on the pod usually. Yeah. Listeners, that concludes our book coverage of Persuasion officially. We'll do the party again, Graham, because is this an alternate party? Graham, can we get alternate party music in here?
Alt rock.
Yeah. Something in that vein. For next time, listeners, we do have some just special goodies coming your way of extra content while we are on hiatus briefly. And then we'll come back at you with the movie adaptations of Persuasion. But until then, stay proper.
And go lock your friend up in a room with her one true love.
Wingman hard.
Wingman hard. Pod and Prejudice is edited by Molly Burdick and audio produced by Graham Cook. Our show art is designed by Torrance Brown. Our show is transcribed by SpeechDocs Podcast Transcription. For transcripts and to learn more about our team, check out our website at podandprejudice.com. To keep up with the show, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Pod and Prejudice. If you love what you hear, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/podandprejudice to see how you can support us, or just drop us a rating and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.